Hi! When I configure a model in Jira, I pay special attention to the field that I want to use in each type of item defined. Too much or inappropriate information may prevent users from using the tool correctly, leading to frustration and lack of interest. In this video, I identify and describe the attributes that I believe to be the most relevant for the types of items I have described in the previous videos. The focus is now on new custom attributes. Now, and before you dive into this video, I strongly recommend that you watch all the previous videos related to the types of items used. After all, understanding each type of item is halfway to successfully grasp the configurations that I explain in this video. Because it's a slightly bigger video than usual, you can access the different sections by clicking the links you have in the description. Each link will take you to the section of the video where I describe the specific sets of fields for each type of item. Now, without further delay, let's take a look at the most relevant fields. The first type of item to be analyzed is the user story, and the first attribute that I will talk about is the backlog priority. I have to say that I prefer to use the visual priority made available in the backlog by using the drag and drop. However, it's not always possible for the teams to use it as the only way to see a prioritized backlog. As such, one of the alternatives that I suggest is to use the Moscow prioritization model to configure this list of value. These are the four key elements: must have, should have, could have, and won't have. The next attribute is the summary. This is one of the most used attributes, and this particular case is used to store the name of the story. A short and straight sentence is more than enough, since this is the name that we usually display in the listings. As for the next element, description, we will use as one of the corresponding to the first of the 3Cs model proposed by Ron Jeffries, the card. As such, I propose it to use it here, so well-known structure to describe a user story. As someone, I want to do something so that I can get the benefit. Conversation is the second of the 3Cs. This description box is where you will register all the items that are pending for discussion with the product owner. Simple sentences are enough. For instance, it's mandatory to request permission to send SMS related with the account maintenance. This attribute will tend to be empty, since as questions start to be answered, they will pass to the acceptance criteria attribute. The acceptance criteria, also known as the confirmation, according to the 3Cs model we just mentioned above, is essential in the context of the user story in the sense that will ensure alignment between the team and the product owner about what to expect from the story. For instance, something like, when completing registration and submitting the application form, the user will receive an email to validate his application. This attribute is extremely important since it should be from here that the team will start thinking about the necessary test cases. The next attribute is the story points, and I guess I can easily say that this is the most famous one where no introduction is needed. Still, it's worth to mention that I prefer to use a predefined list with a modified Fibonacci sequence. Using this predefined list ensures some consistency while using relative estimates. The next attribute is the assignee. I often see this attribute filled with a specific name, like the person responsible to implement the story. After all, that's what the field actually means. Although you can use it in that way, I tend to leave it out since it's the entire team that is responsible to deliver the story and not one person. Of course, if you have a solid multidisciplinary team where each person can indeed go the whole 9 yards on a story, then the assignee can indeed be a good option. Finally, last but not least, we have the achieved attribute. It's a placeholder for the points credited when the story is considered done. Please note that this attribute is not visible initially nor can be manually updated. It's done automatically when the status changes to from done. As you will see in some of my videos, this field can become quite useful when producing different types of reports. And that's it when it comes to the user story. The next type of item is the enabler story. When it comes to the structure, it's not by chance that you barely have any difference between the enabler story and the user story that we just discussed. I believe the most relevant aspect that is worth to mention is the fact that the description, the equivalent to the C card, doesn't have to follow the same structure as in the user story. The enabler story has a more technical or operational perspective that can be reflected in the way that it's written. Apart from this, all the rest remains exactly the same, including the acceptance criteria. The product owner for these enabler stories can be a team member, or even the team, just to ensure that they deliver according to what they expected from themselves. And that's it for the enabler story. Let's now take a look at the bug. When it comes to the backlog, the bug is treated in the exact same way as a story or an enabler story, making it quite normal that they share several attributes: story points, achieved, backlog priority, or the inevitable acceptance criteria have the exact same logic when applied to the user story. Yes, the acceptance criteria. After all, it's only when it's fully verified that the item can be a candidate to be considered done. The attribute description will be used freely to describe the problem found. Now, please note that the information regarding specific elements like the steps to recreate and other related elements should be included in the corresponding attributes. A bug, when planned to be solved in the future, should be included in the product backlog. As such, a relative estimate should be given by the team, and the result should be stored in the story points field. As for the remaining attributes, I believe the following are the ones worth to mention. The attribute steps to recreate should include, very objectively, all the necessary steps to replicate the bug. If you have doubts about this information because you simply don't know how to recreate the bug, then just leave it empty. Since a bug can be found in one of the several environments, in addition to identify the version where it was found, it's important to understand in which environment was detected. The environment attribute serves precisely that purpose. In addition with this attribute, indicating the version where the bug was detected is extremely useful. This is achieved through the use of the affects version attribute. For each bug, it's possible that there is a way to get around it while the bug is not properly resolved. When this happens, the sequence of steps required should be described in the workaround attribute. This also makes it possible to see how difficult or impossible is to get around the current solution. Finally, we have an attribute to help classifying the bug severity, which is useful to help prioritizing the backlog. We are talking about severity, which has a list of values that you can configure according to your specific needs. I believe the most important thing is to ensure that each value of the scale is clearly defined and leaves no doubts about its proper use in each situation. With that, we conclude the analysis of the bug. The next type of item to be analyzed is the subtask. The subtask is the type of item that can be created under any other type of item. It represents the real work that needs to be done to implement or deliver something. One of the most widely used examples is the creation of subtasks under the user story as a result of an iteration planning. By default, I will keep most of the attributes proposed initially when you install Jira. The exception goes to all of those that refer start and end dates. And why is this? Because after all, in our Agile context, we care more about the iteration or sprint where the work will be done and not on the precise dates. The attributes original and remaining estimates are the ones that I want to mention. The original estimate is used to input the team's estimates to complete the subtask. The remaining estimate will be used to keep track of the real remaining time left to complete the subtask. I also included a new attribute called blocked. This checkbox is used to indicate that the subtask is blocked and it's on hold. This can be quite useful if you want to have it visible in your Scrum board, as I will describe in one of the next videos. Now let's take a look at the type of item test. The type of item test can have different origins, depending on the plugin you use. Because of that, different types of attributes can be found. In my model, I didn't make any customization because I believe the proposed structure from plugins like X-Ray is mature enough to provide an adequate solution. In future videos, we will see how we can use the tests to keep track of our requirements coverage level. Now let's take a look at the different project management items. The decision is the first project management item that I will describe. Its structure can be adapted according to the needs of each initiative. In my example, it's aligned with the PM² methodology. Apart from the standard attributes, the following are the ones that I consider the most relevant to mention. The attribute escalation is used to indicate the need to scale a particular decision to the next hierarchical level. Please note that the relevant thing here is not to whom it will be escalated, but instead if it will be indeed necessary to escalate it. Decision owner. This attribute identifies the entity or the person that is accountable for the decision that needs to be made. When you configure this model, you can decide to use Jira user component or, in case you prefer more flexibility, a simple text attribute that allows you to freely indicate any other entity, like for instance an advisory board. Both of them have pros and cons. The identified by attribute is used to register the person that identified the decision to be made. This attribute is different from the reported by, which relates uniquely to the person that registered the decision in the platform. Persons present during decision. This attribute allows you to identify all the people that were present when the decision was taken. It's an important element in case you want to get some clarification about the decision, since you will have several available alternatives. The decision date indicates the date when the decision was taken. Please note that it may not be the same as the one when the decision became effective. This is why I keep them in separate fields. The effective from field indicates the date when the decision came to force. Just like I mentioned before, this date has a different scope since it will allow to understand that a decision, although it was taken in a given moment, took a long time until it became effective. The decision communicated to whom is to keep record of all individuals and/or entities to whom the decision taken was communicated. In other words, it allows you to know who is aware of that decision. Now let's take a look at another project management item, the issue. The first field I would like to describe is the issue owner. The issue owner has the same underlying concept as the decision owner. It's the person accountable for the effective issue resolution and its impact. Just like for the decision, when you are configuring it, you can use either the Jira user component or a free use text field. The identified by field works in the exact same way as for the decision. In this particular case, the person that discovered the issue. The identification date represents the date when the issue was identified. Please note that is different from when the issue was registered, which in that case uses the report date. Because sometimes issues cannot bring consensus around their resolution, it's important to have an indication that this issue needs to be escalated. This is what the attribute escalation is used for. Impact. Every issue needs an impact assessment, and that is what the impact attribute is for. The chosen scale goes from 1 to 5. However, you can use any other list of values that adapts to your reality. Of course, if you want to perform some mathematical operations or calculations that involve impact, then you obviously need to use a numeric scale. Above all, and whatever scale you use, make sure that everyone knows what each level means and in each situation they should be used. The attribute action details is used to describe all the actions that are foreseen to be taken in order to help solving the issue. It's up to you to decide what level of detail you want to include, but I usually recommend to have at least the person responsible for each action. Target resolution date. This field is obvious. However, you may want to consider that an issue can be the product of several different items related to it. This means that you may need to take into account several different dates. For example, the target resolution date of a risk that impacts the issue, and the effective from date of a decision that also affects the same issue need to be considered when determining the target resolution date. The urgency is one way to prioritize the resolution of issues. Just like before, this is a list that can be configured according to your reality. Also, it's very important that all the people that create and manage the issues are totally familiarized with the specific criteria when assigning a level of urgency. The next item to analyze is the risk. The first field is the identified by. Just like for the similar attributes described before, this attribute is used to identify the person who identified the item, and in this case, the risk. Together with the identified by attribute comes the identification date. As before, this date represents the date when the person described in the identified by attribute identified the risk. It can be very useful when compared with other date attributes, like the target resolution date. The likelihood is the measure used to determine the likelihood of the risk to happen. I recommend using a numeric scale since it will be used in the calculation of the risk level, as I will describe after. The attribute impact is used to classify the impact the risk will have in case it becomes real. Just like the likelihood, I recommend using a numeric scale since it will be used to determine the risk level. The next attribute is called the risk level. This attribute is not visible during the creation of the risk because it's a calculated product between the likelihood and the impact. This calculation should be performed every time there is a change, either one of those two attributes. To implement this calculation, I use a Jira plugin called Script Runner from Activist, which I'm sure you will know. The risk owner is the person responsible for the risk. As you will see after, this attribute is closely related to the response strategy, since this person will lead the implementation of the strategy. Just like I described for the issues and decisions, the escalation attribute indicates whenever it's needed to escalate the analysis of the decision process related to the risk. Please note that this attribute is only used to indicate if escalation is necessary. For additional information, you can use the field Action Details, for instance, or the Description field. Materialized. This is a very simple but yet relevant field. This checkbox will allow you to indicate if the risk has materialized or not. In other words, to understand if it became or not a reality. This can be quite relevant if you want, for instance, to have an idea of the risk level of all materialized risks. Response strategy. The main goal of the response strategy is to register the main strategic decision when it comes to manage the risk. The list I recommend follows the PM² methodology. However, feel free to create your own list. Also very important, this field should be analyzed together with the attribute Action Details, as I will describe next, since it will materialize the chosen response strategy. The Action Details field is used to register and describe the actions or the activities the team will implement according to the chosen strategy, as described in the Response Strategy attribute. Analyzing both fields together will give you a full picture about you, your company, your team, plan to cope with the risk. The next attribute is the Contingency Details. This attribute allows you to describe what is the contingency plan foresee in case the risk materializes and becomes a reality. No need to say that this field should always be filled regardless if the risk will materialize or not. After all, managing risks without a contingency plan is a recipe for disaster. The next attribute is the target resolution date. Whatever strategy you choose or the current risk situation is, materialized or not, it's important to have a concrete idea about when you expect to have the risk resolved. In other words, when will the risk no longer be a risk? For that, you use the target resolution date. The next type of item to analyze is the change request. The next type of item to analyze is the change request. The identified by field's objective is to have the person who identified the need of the described change request. In other words, the person who requested the change request. As we saw before for other types of items, this attribute is different from the reported by attribute. The identification date goal is to point out the date when the need for the change request was identified. This attribute works together with the identified by described before, as they will allow you to understand the starting point of the change request. Action Details. Just like with the other types of items analyzed before, this field records the action details and activities that are required to implement the change request. Now, as you will see in one of the next videos, the change request body of work is made of several links which identify the items that should be delivered to complete it. In this case, you can use the Action Details field to briefly explain those links. The attribute size is used to represent a relative measure of size that makes sense when compared with the existing ones. Assigning sizes independently without using other change requests as a reference makes no sense and makes this attribute useless. As explained in one of the next videos, change requests will be linked to other types of items that represent the work that needs to be done. You can explore those in order to get a more detailed idea about the effort that is involved and use that information to help you assign a value for the size, but always when comparing to other change requests. After all, this is a similar exercise to the one that you perform when, for instance, you're estimating stories. Escalation. There's not much to say about the escalation attribute, as almost everything has been already said. In the case of the change request, the escalation means that the decision of implementation has to be made by higher management. The decision attribute aims to describe what has been decided regarding the implementation of the change request, especially when implementation focuses only on a part of what is described in the action details. The decision date attribute represents the date when the decision to implement the change request has been made. This attribute is usually analyzed together with the decision attribute that I've just described. Target delivery date. The target delivery date aims to give a rough idea of when will the change request be completed. Please note that this might not be easy to identify, especially if the change request is to be delivered in several stages. In that case, it's up to you to decide which criteria you want to follow. Approved by. The attribute approved by identifies the person or committee that has approved the change request described in the decision attribute and the corresponding actions described in the action details attribute. And that's it for the change request. No need to say that some of these attributes will probably be filled in different moments in time, depending on when you get the necessary information. The next type of item to analyze in terms of attributes is the support type of item. Apart from the normal and standard fields available in Jira, the following fields, standard and custom, should be included in the support type of item. Priority. This is a standard attribute. Here, the most important thing is the selection of the scale to be used. Unlike stories or enabler stories, where I use the Moscow model for this task, I recommend using the standard values originally settled: blocker, critical, major, minor, trivial, since they don't require any particular knowledge. However, and like I mentioned before, make sure that everyone agrees and has the same understanding about when using each of these values. Summary. As I described before, and as in for most types of items, it's used to identify the element, preferably with just one sentence. In this case, the support request. Description. The description is the attribute where the requester registers all the information about the support request, especially the context in which the support is needed. Action and details. With the analysis of the support request, it is important to define the action plan and the corresponding details to allow an adequate response. The plan may also include references to possible dependencies with other types of items. Reported by. The reported by attribute refers to the person who reported the support request on Jira, which I assume is the same person who felt the need in the first place. As such, the attribute identified by is not needed. And that's all for the support item. This concludes our analysis for project management types of items. Now let's take a look on the requirements management items, and the first one to be analyzed is the need. The need is a very important element as it represents the reasoning behind the solution being built, in this particular case, a software development solution. In small projects, it is usually connected to the business or enabler epic that materialize it. The goal is to understand how each need can be satisfied by the proposed solution. Summary. Again, like described before, it aims to present a simple but objective sentence. In this case, it's about the need to be addressed. The use of phrases that can be focused on the solution should be avoided, as this is the role of the epics that are going to be developed. Description. This is the attribute where you can find the most concrete description of the need. including its origin and how can it be satisfied. A reference to a particular section of the business problem is usually also a good idea to include. Owner. The owner is the business person that is responsible to ensure that the need will be satisfied by the proposed solution. It's up to you to decide if you want to configure this field with the Jira user selection component or if you want to make it less restrictive and allow any name to be entered. And that's it for the need. Let's take a look now in the next requirement item, the epic. The epic will be used to describe an item that will be implemented by the teams focused on need satisfaction, regardless if you're talking about business or enabler epics. Summary. As before, the attribute summary should describe with an objective and simple sentence the stuff that needs to be developed, taking into account that you are now in the context of the solution to be developed. The epic name. The epic name is to be used in Jira to establish the connection between the epic and the elements that will contain, in our case, stories, bugs, enabler stories, etc. Since it's the only usage of this field, I strongly recommend that you use the same sentence that you use in the summary field. It goes without saying that if you update the summary, you should also update the epic name. Type of epic. The type of epic is what will allow you to know if it's focused on business functionality or more about the enablement of those epics. As you have already seen by now, the concept of enablement is ingrained in the model I proposed at different levels of the solution. As an example of enabler epic is the development of some architectural components that can be used to build and materialize the solution architecture. Description. The attribute description can be used to provide additional information about the epic that is not included in the benefit hypothesis nor in the acceptance criteria. For instance, you can use this field to give some additional information about the purpose of the epic and how it will contribute to tackle the need to that it relates to. Acceptance criteria. Just like it happens with the stories, enabler stories, etc., the epics also have acceptance criteria defined by the business and agreed with the team. The acceptance criteria is a key element to help the owners and the teams to validate if the epic is delivering what was expected. Please note that the acceptance criteria of an epic is not the roll-up of the acceptance criteria of the stories that are part of it. In other words, just because all the stories that are part of the epic have all been accepted, that doesn't mean that the epic will be. The acceptance criteria of an epic is built based on the epic as a whole and not as the sum of the smaller wholes. Owner. The owner is the person from the business or architecture, depending on the type of epic, that has a vested interest in the implementation of the epic. He is also responsible for the acceptance of the epic, for which he establishes the acceptance criteria. Minimum viable product. The need to define a minimum viable product to test the viability of an initiative makes it necessary to identify the epics that you believe that should be part of it. This is the goal of this attribute. Additionally, as you continue to explore and test the viability of your initiative, the context, size and scope of the MVP will continue to evolve. This means that new epics may be classified as part of an MVP, while others may stop being part of it. The benefit hypotheses represent the expected and measurable benefits for the final users and the business. In the end, the other reason why the epic exists in the first place. If you can't enumerate the benefit hypothesis of an epic, then it's very likely that it doesn't bring any added value, and because of that, it shouldn't be implemented. Also make sure that you properly enumerate the benefits in a concrete and objective way so that they can be measured and addressed. Sprint. By default, I don't implement epics in a sprint. Instead, I implement their corresponding stories, and as such, the best I can do is to associate the foreseen ending sprint to the epic. For scaled solutions using SAFe, I will show in the future videos that I will plan and identify the conclusion of the epics in the program board, specific for the Big Picture plugin. Actual business value. The actual business value attribute is used to measure how much value the epic brings to the business stakeholders. I use a numeric scale because this attribute will be used in a specific formula as I'll show after. Additionally, I recommend you to use it as a relative scale and not as an absolute one. In other words, the actual business value should be determined based on a comparison with other epics and not just based on an individual perspective. Using a scale from 1 to 10 Being 1 the least relevant and the 10 the most relevant is definitely a good approach. Time criticality. The time criticality attribute is used to evaluate how urgent is the implementation of the epic. This can be done not only by the business but also by the team architect when dealing with enabler epics. Just like it's done with the actual business value, you should assign the time criticality value based on a comparison with other epics and not just on an individual and atomic assessment. You should also use the same scale defined for the actual business value. The risk reduction and opportunity enablement attribute measures how important is the epic when it comes to reducing risks likelihood or to increase new opportunities enablement. Just like for the previous two attributes, you should assign this value based on a relational perspective, which means comparing the epics regarding this particular element. Also, make sure you use the same scale as for the previous two attributes, the actual business value and the time criticality. Story points. This attribute requires no introduction. This is a relative measure of size, in this case, of the epic. You estimate the size of the epics just like you do with the stories. However, these story points are not used to calculate the team's velocity. Instead, I will use them as part of the WSGF formula that will help prioritizing the epic's backlog. This is a very common activity when scaling Agile. WSGF. The WSGF, weigh the shortest job first, is a formula that can be used to prioritize your backlog of epics, among other items as I'll show later in this video. The result is given by a formula that has the actual business value, the time criticality, and the risk reduction opportunity enablement, and divides that by the story points. The epics with the higher WSGF are the ones that should be on the top of the backlog. Program increment. The program increment attribute is a concept made popular with SAFe, which represents the time period where the stuff gets built. In our case, I want to know in which program increment will each epic be built and delivered. This attribute is automatically created when a specific plugin called Big Picture Enterprise is installed, part of my proposed solution. It's then filled automatically when using the plugin to assign the epics to a program increment. And that's it for the epic. Now let's take a look at the use case item. Use case. I have the use case as part of my model because it can give you the flexibility to choose other options when keeping track of your solution. When it comes to Jira, I see the use of the use cases, together with the use case slices, as an alternative to the use of epics and user stories. Now please note that due to the high flexibility of this model, nothing actually prevents you from using all of them together. Summary. Summary's attribute is used to incorporate the key sentence that describes the use case goal. It's not in the context of this video how to write use cases, but it's highly recommended that your description starts with an action verb. Description. The attribute description can be used to include additional elements that help understanding the use case. Still, you can skip this field if you believe that all information available in the attributes like preconditions, basic flow, alternative flow, etc. is enough. Precondition. The precondition field is one of the key elements used while describing a use case. Like the name mentions, it's used to describe all the preconditions that must be observed so that the use case can be executed. Because you can have several preconditions, just make sure you identify them all in this field. Basic flow. The basic flow attribute, also known as main flow, is used to describe the most frequent flux of interactions between the user and the system that will lead to a successful execution of the use case. Make sure you take advantage of the HTML properties of the text editor to make your description clear and easy to read. Alternative flow. The alternative flow attribute is used to describe the several alternative scenarios that come from forcing changes to the execution of the basic flow. Although all the alternative scenarios are described using the same attribute, make sure you make good use of the HTML properties of the editor to have the scenarios described in a clear and independent way. Exceptional flow. The exceptional flow, just like the alternative flow, it also describes alternative scenarios. However, the key difference is the fact that the exceptional flow records unforeseen situations in the execution of the basic flow, like for instance an error. For me, the key advantage of having these two different attributes instead of just one to identify alternative and exceptional scenarios is the audience that they are aimed for. You can say, for instance, that exceptional flows are more technically oriented, while the alternative flows are more business oriented. Still, if you prefer to treat them all as simply as alternative scenarios, just go ahead and skip this attribute. Post-conditions. The post-conditions attribute is used to describe the conditions that should be verified when the use case is successfully completed. They are a sort of acceptance criteria that I have described for the user stories, epics, etc. The post-conditions should be described in a clear and objective way so that they can be easily validated. WSGF. The attributes actual business value, time criticality, risk reduction opportunity enablement, and story points, and of course WSGF, are to be used in the exact same way as for the epic. After all, just like I mentioned before, I see the usage of use cases and use case slices as an alternative approach to requirements management using epics and stories. For that, you can refer to the epic section to see more information about the WSGF. And now that we have finished with the use case, let's take a look at the use case slice. Use case slice. The use case slice is the twin brother of the user story. They were created by Ivar Jakobson in order to be able to decompose the use case in small chunks that can be digested by the team while implementing a use case. As such, I treat them in a very similar way as the user stories. Now let's take a look at the most relevant fields. The first field is the priority. The priority works just like I described it for the user stories, which includes the use of the Moscow model. The visual ordering offered by Jira can also be used through the attribute rank. However, such option is not very clear, especially for those who are analyzing a list for the first time, since there is no visual indication of that ordering. Still, it's a matter of choice and you should choose the one that suits you the best. Summary. To put it simple, the summary is used to indicate the name of the use case slice that represents either a use case scenario, a part of it, or several scenarios. Once again, make sure that it's clear and objective. Description. When using this attribute, I like to use the same approach as for the other user stories, the first of the 3 C's card. As someone, I want to do something so that I can get a benefit. Acceptance criteria. Nothing much to say about the acceptance criteria, except that I see it exactly in the same way as for the user stories. They must be objective, since they will guide the creation and execution of relevant tests. Sprint. The sprint, if you are using use case slices, and assuming that you are using Scrum boards, you will then plan their execution just like you would for the user stories. Story points. Just like for the sprint described before, the story points are used in the exact same way as for the user stories. They provide a relative measure of size and they are used to help determining the velocity of the team. So, this was the last of the requirements items that I have in the model. Next, let's take a look at the scaling Agile items and their most important fields. The first one is the PI objective. PI objective. For the PI objective, these are the most relevant fields. Summary. The attribute summary is used in the context to describe an objective of a PI. Please note that you can have either a team PI objective or a program PI objective. Whatever is the origin of that objective, make sure that you write it in a smart way, since it will be evaluated by the business. Description. The field description can be used to provide additional information regarding the PI objective. For instance, some observations made by the business when assessing the objective. Still, just because you can add some additional information in the description, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't strive to have a flawless summary of your PI objective. The next attribute is the planned business value. In the final set of a PI planning, business owners will assign each PI objective the value they believe the objective has for them. This value will be the reference and will be kept as a baseline throughout the entire PI. By the end of it, a new assessment will be made during the inspect and adapt session. And then that's when the actual business value comes into play. This attribute is used to record the effective business value that business believes the teams delivered during the program increment. This value will be recorded after the PI demo during the inspect and adapt session. The actual business value will then be compared with the planned business value in order to help calculating the predictability measure of each team. Stretch objective. This field is used to manage the stakeholders' expectations. So, Every time the team is not 100% sure that they will be able to complete the PI objective they are proposing, they should mark it as a stretch, in this case, ticking this checkbox. Now you may ask how you will recognize if you are towards a team or program PI objective. Well, the first way you have to do that is by simply looking at the Jira project area where the objective is registered, since every team has one. The same goes for the program, which will also have its own Jira project area. The program objectives will be registered. On the other hand, by using one of the plugins that I recommend, you have that functionality already embedded, which will help with the identification and management of the PI objectives. The next item is the portfolio epic. And let's see the most important attributes of this element that represents a big strategic initiative. Portfolio epic. A portfolio epic is a container for a significant solution development initiative that captures the more substantial investments that occur within a portfolio. Let's take a look at some of the most important fields. Summary. Just like in the previous cases, this field is used to clearly identify what's the main purpose or goal of the portfolio epic. Description. As for the description, it will be used to provide a more detailed description about the initiative itself, including the goal, the target audience, or the person and benefits that will bring, etc. A sort of what is usually called the elevator pitch. I usually use the product vision statement that you can see in the video. Type. This field is used to identify the type of epic that you are dealing with. It can be a business epic or an enabler epic. The first one is all about delivering business value, while the second one is used to describe elements or initiatives that support the delivery of the business epics. This is achieved by the upcoming implementation of the so-called architectural runway. Business outcomes. The business outcomes represent the benefits that you expect to achieve if the formulated hypothesis about these epics and describing the attribute descriptions materializes. The business outcomes should be objective and quantifiable so that they can be clearly assessed by the leading indicators. Leading indicators. These are the elements that will objectively tell you how you will evaluate the business outcomes previously indicated. You can include as many as needed. The lead indicators play a fundamental role since they will guide you while determining the metrics that you want to use. WSGF. The attributes actual business value, time criticality, risk reduction opportunity enablement, story points, and of course WSGF work in the exact same way as for the epic, use case, etc. Specifically, WSGF is a measure used to help prioritization, in this case, the portfolio epics. Owner. The epic owner is responsible for guiding individual epics throughout the portfolio Kanban system from identification. After the epic is approved, the epic owner works with the Agile teams to initiate the development activities necessary to realize the epic's business outcome hypothesis, while enterprise architects shepherd the enabler epics that support the technical considerations for business epics. And that's it for the portfolio epic. Let's now take a look at the solution and program epics. Solution and program epic. As I had the opportunity to refer in the video about scaling items, the solution and program epics are quite similar to the portfolio epic. Because of that, their structure is essentially the same. Maybe one of the few but important differences is the fact that the solution epic is shared in the context of a solution train throughout several PIs. The program epic, on the other hand, is also implemented throughout several PIs, but only in the context of a unique Agile release train. The next item is the capability. Capability. A capability is quite similar to the Jira epic that I have described in the requirements video, and not the portfolio solution or program epic that you've seen before. As such, it's not a surprise that all the identified attributes are essentially the same. Both epic and capability are developed in the course of a PI. However, since the capability is developed in the context of a solution train, this should be split in the corresponding epics that will then be assigned to the different trains. So, as you could see, there is some work to be done in terms of the field's configuration before you start using your Jira platform to support your Agile initiatives. The specifications I just presented are the result of several years of a continuous cycle of definition, trial, measuring, and adjusting. So, although this can provide you a good foundation for your starting point, make sure you keep measuring, adjusting, and try your own ideas and concepts. In the next video, I will talk about another very important configuration element, the workflows.